All aboard, everyone, for the time travel tour of Railsland. Get on board this bus. Make sure you have your chrono-passports ready. We are traveling back in time to the early 2000s, and you're going to need this. I'm your tour guide, Joël Quenneville. I've been doing this tour for over a decade, and I hope you have a good time. All right, everybody on board? Let's go to the past. So Railsland is a really magical place, a place where people have built together, have created community, have created something that's really magical. And in Railsland, there are a lot of buildings, and wait, what's that? Oh, the exit? What about the exit? Oh, that was our exit. Oh no. Oops, I think I just missed our exit to Railsland. I'm sorry, I was so excited to tell you about it that I wasn't paying attention. I've got a little bit of bad news for you. On this particular time travel road, our next exit isn't going to be until the 1600s. So we're going to do a little bit of a detour. I do apologize, but I am excited about Railsland. On the flip side, the 1600s are kind of an interesting period as well. Sometimes I run tours back there, so I can share a few fun facts while we're doing there. Don't worry, I'll turn the bus around, we'll make it to Railsland. Something that's happening in the early 1600s, we've got some early scientists, or at least that's what we would call them. They would probably use the term something closer to natural philosophers. Science isn't really a thing yet. So when these three and others are doing some of their work, they don't have any scientific journals to publish in. Instead, what they're doing is they share their ideas and their experiments by writing letters. Some of these are letters directly to each other. Some of them are open letters that get circulated. And that's how ideas spread. Now, these three in particular, and another group around them, describe that sort of community that they have created for each other as an invisible college. It's not a real university, but it's a network of these early scientists writing to each other. And this invisible college will eventually evolve into the British Royal Society, which is one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the modern day. But this is not just a British phenomenon. We see this throughout Europe, that early scientists, mathematicians, philosophers are writing to each other to share their ideas, and so much so that in the modern day, historians refer to this period as the Republic of Letters. All right, we've got to our turnaround. Sorry for the delay here, and we're going to head to Railsland. As I was saying, the Republic of Letters was a time period where there was a lot of exchange of ideas, but it was all this very informal, just sharing through writing. And you know, now that I think of it, that's not all that different than how the community of Railsland was built. There were lots of influential blog posts and talks. If you were at the keynote this morning, you heard a lot about some wonderful keynotes that built up Railsland. And on this tour, what I want to do is I want to showcase a few of my favorite blog posts that were influential on our community. So jumping forward to the early 2000s, here we are. Welcome to Railsland. So we're going to start here at the Railsland Museum, and we're going to get off this bus. This is a walking tour. And I think we've already had enough issues with this bus. Clearly, I should not be driving. So the Railsland Museum houses a lot of cultural artifacts that are important to the community of Rails. Normally, I start the tour by taking you through the museum and showing you some of those artifacts. Because of our little detour through the 1600s, we're going to skip that. But if you're ever back in town, I do recommend going in. It's worth the price of admission. So come with me. We're going to walk through town, and we're going to head to the central square. This is Pattern Plaza, and we're going to start on the north side. Now, Pattern Plaza is a very central part of Railsland. It's the area where the community gets together to debate structure, to debate patterns, to think about how we're going to build applications that are easy to read, easy to modify, and easy to build on. And our first building that we're going to look at is a 2006 construction by James Buck, Fat Model Skinny Controller. This is a little bit of an older building that you can see. And just to set the stage a little bit, give you some context. This is a time where Rails has just come out. It's been 3 years. And the common way to do development still is to write a single giant file of PHP and FTP it up directly to a server, potentially via tools like FileZilla. Anybody remember FileZilla? Yeah, good times, or maybe not so good times. This is the year that a very young Joël is first getting his hands dirty with web development. And it's also a time where people are starting to build more serious applications. But a big question is coming up for the community, and that is, as applications grow, where should your logic go? And Rails already kind of has an answer to that because of MVC. But the boundaries are blurry. So the big idea of James's article is that all the logic, or all the interesting logic, should go into your model layer. So James suggests that it should not go into the view, sort of like old school PHP, where it's effectively just one giant ERB file with everything from SQL queries down. And that was pretty well accepted. But more controversially, it should also not be in the controller. The controller should be a very thin layer that handles HTTP and makes connections to the model. And instead, all the interesting logic, the things that make your application, probably need to live in the model layer. And this was really impactful. It opened a conversation around where logic should go. And it opened the conversation. It did not open and close, because that's a conversation that continues through the history of Rails land up to the present day. It emphasized that the model layer is where things should go, brought in some terms that people still use that I've heard people throw around this conference even today. And it helped refine what MVC means in the context of Rails. So pull out your chrono-passports. We'll add our first stamp there. And then I'd like you to look at another building next door. This one's from 2008 by Joe Ferris, Waiting for a Factory Girl. And the Rails community has always been big about testing. And the default way to test in Rails is a system called fixtures. So with fixtures, what you do is you set up your data up front, and then the entire test suite has access to it. So you might have a user named Alice, who's an administrator, and maybe a user named Bob, who has been problematic and is now banned from the app. And then your test could run assertions. Now, part of the frustration that Joe is feeling is the presence of mystery guests in tests. And a mystery guest is something in your test that just sort of comes from the global context, that you can't tell just by looking at the test. So you might see an assertion that says, Bob does not have access to do these things, and you're asking yourself, who is Bob? And why does Bob not have access? And you'd have to just know the story of the fixtures to know, oh, that's the person who is banned. And so Joe pitches a different idea. The idea that tests are more readable when setup is inline. And Joe doesn't just pitch an idea. He also says, hey, I wrote a library to make this style of testing easier. It's a library that most of you are probably at least a little bit familiar with. Joe introduces it as Factory Girl. Today we know it as Factory Bot, and it's probably in most of you all's gem files today. And this has now become the sort of default community approach to testing, writing tests with setup that is local. Now, this was only the beginning of a whole lot of debates about how do we want to handle test setup. If you're using RSpec, is pulling setup out into a let or a before block still count as local? Or is that adding mystery guests? What about shared context and examples? And in more modern times, we've seen a bit of a return to the idea of fixtures. Because fixtures are faster, and we all want a faster test suite. So we're re-examining some of the trade-offs and saying, is more speed worth the readability costs? Or maybe there's some clever ways to square the circle. That conversation is still ongoing. You can see there's a little bit of construction happening on the building right there. I want to give a big shout out to the Thoughtbot blog, which is where this article is published. Thoughtbot's blog has been going on for 2 decades. There are thousands of articles on Rails and web development, articles that have really shaped our community. And so big shout out to Thoughtbot for the ways that they've invested and shared in building Railstown. All right, let's put our stamp in our chrono-passport and move on to the next one. So this is one where when I was planning this tour, and I was asking around what should be the stops on this tour, everybody told me this is the one you've got to have. This was an incredibly influential article. And you can tell by the title that's already connecting back to that first one by Jameis Buck. And so in a world where people have been moving all of their logic to the model layer, we're now encountering another problem. Models have gotten huge. Sometimes thousands of lines and hundreds of methods in the public interface. And so Brian here introduces a big idea, and that's that your model layer doesn't have to be all active record objects. There are patterns beyond active record. And if you're hearing that and you're wait, active record pattern? Yes, Rails did not invent the idea of active record. If you were at Caleb's talk earlier today, you would have heard a little bit more about the origin of that. But it is a pattern that Rails chose to implement. But your model layer can be more than that. Now, we don't have time to look at all 7 patterns today, but I do want to showcase a few. One here is a value object, which is commonly taking a primitive that has a lot of methods that operate on it and pulling it out of your model into its own dedicated object. And value objects are not necessarily a thing that you have to build yourself. There are some that are just built into Ruby and Rails itself. There are also form objects. There's a variety of uses for these, but one that Brian highlights is the ability to have something that behaves like a single active record object, but is a layer over one or more writes to the database. And finally, there's the service object, where you sort of take some logic, pull it out, just wrap it in a class, and expose it via a single method. This one has a lot of caveats on it. Here are the ones that Brian lists. The idea that your action has to be complex, that it reaches across multiple models, that it's not a core concern of any underlying model, and that there might be multiple ways of doing that action. Keep this in mind, because this is something that's going to come up later. But this article was talked about everywhere. And these patterns were not just a thing back in 2012. They're patterns that we see in our apps still today. It catalyzed a lot of conversations around the use of patterns in Rails apps, exploring other things that object-oriented development could offer us, some ideas from domain-driven design, and even some a little bit more out there architectures like hexagonal Rails that build on top of Rails. So let's add our stamp to our chrono-passports, make sure we're all together, and I'm going to take us to a different part of town now. So join me. We're going to walk across down this street behind this building to Philosophy Row. So unlike Pattern Plaza, that's very practical and thinking about how code should be structured, Philosophy Row takes a little bit more of a step back and thinks through how should we think about code? How should we think about doing things on the web? And our first stop here is 2012 construction, Rails is Omakase by DHH. And this is a world where JavaScript is now becoming much more mainstream. It's fast. We've got jQuery now. Front-end frameworks are starting to get started. And Rails has made some bold choices. It's made a bet on CoffeeScript. It's made jQuery its default library. And it uses a thing called the asset pipeline. And some people aren't too happy about that. And there's a lot of pushback and suggestions that maybe we should be able to swap out different pieces or change a lot of the architecture altogether. And DHH argues that a framework that has its own vision of the web is stronger. It's something that can actually push a positive vision of where the web should be instead of just being reactive. And this is sort of the context that the article's written, but the community has sort of taken this and interpreted it in a slightly different direction. So the big idea here, as often the community interprets it, is that using Rails defaults tends to give you better results. Because it is an opinionated framework, if you stay close to where the framework wants you, you're going to have a better time. And the term omakase has sort of entered the vocabulary. People don't tend to say vanilla Rails, they'll say omakase Rails. And in fact, there was a talk earlier this morning that had that in the title, omakase for the front end. All right, let's add our stamp to our chrono-passport. There's one more I want to show you here in Philosophy Row. And that is 2016's The Wrong Abstraction by Sandy Metz. Now remember when I mentioned that there was a lot of excitement around OO ideas and patterns following the 7 articles, or the 7 patterns article. So this is the context in which this is happening. And people are exploring a lot of things, trying a lot of abstractions. And Sandy had given a talk a few years earlier at RailsConf titled All the Little Things, exploring a lot of these OO ideas. Now, as a side note, Sandy is one of the best Rails speakers I've ever seen. For those of you who are newer to the community, I really recommend go back, find one of those videos and watch it. It might be life-changing. But Sandy wants to take some ideas from that talk and turn them into a blog post. And there's one phrase that she comes back to, the idea that duplication is cheaper than the wrong abstraction. And this is a phrase that really connects with the community. The idea that sometimes it's better to sit with the discomfort of duplicated code, or maybe messy code, and not abstract immediately, and to wait until you can find the right abstraction. And this is a phrase that 10 years later, we still hear in the community. I'm sure many of you may have even heard this, someone mentioned it on a pull request, or maybe you're pairing, and somebody says that to you. Maybe you never knew where that phrase came from. You're like, wow, my senior developer is so full of wisdom, has these great phrases. Thank you, Sandy, for that. The Rails community is a community that I think balances idealism and pragmatic concerns. We're a community that really values productivity. And I think that this article embodies that. All right, let's put a stamp on our chrono-passport. 2016 is a little bit later than all the other ones, so let's put it on the other page. I like sorting them by chronological order. All right, now we're going to move to a slightly different part of town. This is Ops Alley. And you'll notice it's a little bit more industrial. There's maybe a little bit less polish on it. And this is a part of town where people focus less on writing the code and more about shipping it to production. And our first building I want to point out right here, maybe doesn't look like much, but you can see there's a lot that it's holding up, there's a lot building on top of it, is the 2011 12-factor app by Adam Wiggins. So this is coming at a time where the cloud is becoming more mainstream, but many do custom setups on their own hardware still. We're still deploying on our own boxes. And this article came out of work at Heroku. And I say article, but it's a little bit more of a manifesto. You might even call it a microsite. And there are 12 ideas of factors that make your app easier to deploy. And again, we don't have time to look at all 12, but I want to highlight a few right here. The idea of having parity between development and production. The idea of having explicit dependencies. And the example that the article gives is declaring which gems you depend on in a gem file. Some of you might be looking at me being like, isn't that the only way? Why wouldn't you deploy without a gem file? If you have your own server, just SSH into a box, you could ask your admin to gem install a bunch of stuff so that when you deploy your app, gems are already there and you just assume that they're there. Now, if you want to deploy to a different box, your code's going to crash. And so that's one of the reasons that 12-factor suggests doing that, because now your code is much more portable from one box to another. Similarly, the idea of environment-based coding. If you see people who want to put their configuration in environment variables, this is where it comes from. And again, the idea is that you can deploy the same code to multiple different environments, production, staging, maybe a demo, maybe a QA, and they can all be a little bit different while still all be running the same code. I was trying to extract one big idea out of the 12 factors, and the best I could come up with was the idea that apps should be environment independent. That idea that you can go to any of those different boxes and deploy the same code and it should work. It should be easy. Now, if the 7 patterns is probably the most impactful article that most people have heard of, I think this one is the flip side. This might be the most impactful article that you've never heard of, but I guarantee you that your deployment setup is built on ideas from that article. So if there's one article to go back and read, this might be the one. Also, this is an article from 2011, so we're going to put that stamp way back on the left side of our chrono-passport. All right, next one here in Ops Alley. This one here is a little bit of a surprise maybe to some of you. This is a lesser known article, and I picked it to sort of stand in for a certain movement within the community. The idea that we can get more performance out of our apps, not necessarily just by writing code, but by changing how we configure things, how we configure our servers. And the big idea from this article, from Nate Berkopec, is that we can tune processes and threads to get more performance out of our servers. If you've ever had conversations with colleagues about what is the optimal amount of connections to have in your active record pool, how many concurrent workers should we have to manage our queue? How many should we be focusing on threads or processes for our web server? These are all ideas that come out of this movement and that are partly addressed by this article by Nate and a lot of other work that Nate and others have done. So it's a 2017 article. We'll add that. This is a little bit after Sandy's. So we'll stamp that in our chrono-passport and then move to a different part of town. And I'm going to take you back to Pattern Plaza because that's my happy place. I love thinking about these things. But now we're going to be on the south side, which is a little bit more modern. And the first building I want to point out is a 2015 construction, Monoliths First by Martin Fowler. This is a world where microservices are starting to become popular, particularly after Netflix shared that they had been having a lot of success with that pattern. And so everybody wanted on. And the big idea from Martin's article is that monoliths should be your default starting architecture. Not that microservices are bad or that you can't do them in Ruby or that you shouldn't do them in Ruby, but they shouldn't be where you start. If you don't know your needs, a monolith is probably what you want. And this is something that becomes really compelling to the community. People accept this as best practice, and even today, when people talk about architecture in the Rails community, you'll often hear the suggestion, start with a monolith, you can break it up later if you need to. There's a cost to running microservices, and don't pay that cost if you don't need to. Now, something that's really interesting if you read the article, because I've seen it quoted a lot, is that Martin has a very questioning tone. He lays out the argument in a way that's really convincing, but then says, this is the argument I've heard, I'm still on the fence about it, I need more information before I make a recommendation one way or another. But it's convincing enough that everybody quotes this article anyway. All right, 2015, so I'm going to put that in the top right of our chrono-passport, and we're going to move on. Still in Pattern Plaza, this one is 2023, so much more modern, Beware of Service Object in Rails by Jason Sweat. So remember how I mentioned that in the 7 patterns, the service object was a sort of easy way to extract logic out. And what has happened over the decades since then is that it has become the pattern. It's so easy to do because you don't have to think really about boundaries, you don't have to think about modeling, you can just take arbitrary chunks of code, pull them into a method, put them in an object, and be done with it. And it is now sort of the way that everybody handles extractions. And Jason argues that by doing that, service objects give up a lot of the power of object-oriented programming. Not that necessarily service objects are bad, but that they shouldn't be our main solution when it comes to things. There are other patterns, there are other solutions that we can use that will give us more value. But it also means we have to take the time to think about things like boundaries and modeling. So it's a little bit more upfront work than you'd get from a service object. All right, let's stamp that in our passport. And for the last one, I'm going to take you to a neighborhood that's a little bit different. Some of you might even feel slightly uncomfortable. We're going to cross the river. We're going to JavaScript Junction. This is a very colorful neighborhood. It's got a lot of character, a lot of individuality. Every building does things a little bit differently. That's a great place to be. It's very eclectic. And the one I want to highlight here is a 2024 construction by Radan Skorik. Should you use Hotwire or a front-end framework? And Radan has this thesis that applications on the front end are solving sort of one of two main problems. If your biggest problem you're trying to solve is shared state between the server and the front end, Radan suggests that Hotwire is the best solution. On the other hand, if the biggest problem that your app is trying to solve is visual interactions, then a front-end framework like React might be a better fix. But what about something that falls in between? Radan is partial to Hotwire and kind of has this big idea that HTML over the wire is often the best balance between interactivity and effort. Again, it's a very pragmatic take focused on productivity. And this has kind of been the story of JavaScript on Rails for a long time. If any of you remember unobtrusive JavaScript from the early 2010s, a lot of the same ideas just repackaged in a nicer framework with Hotwire. So let's put our stamp in there. Congratulations, you've filled out your chrono-passport. So the sun is setting. I'm going to walk you all to the train station. You're all taking the train home because I don't think you trust me to drive you in a bus back to 2025. While we're here at the train station, though, just want to think back on 10 big ideas from the Rails community that we've seen today on the tour. Hopefully, you had fun. So the big ideas were that most logic goes in the model layer, tests are more readable when setup is in line, there are patterns beyond active record. Using Rails defaults gives you the best results. Duplication is cheaper than the wrong abstraction. Apps should be environment independent. Tuning processes or threads can yield better performance. Monoliths should be your default starting architecture. Service objects give up some of the benefits of the OO paradigm. And finally, HTML over the wire is the best balance between interactivity and effort. So looking at all those big ideas, is there a theme that we see over and over? Maybe some sort of unified big idea from the last 20 years of the Rails community? And as I was trying to synthesize this, what came to mind is what's basically a modern Rails marketing slogan. Rails is a one-person framework. Not that Rails is made just for solo developers, but it's focused on both idealism to try to make things better, but also a very pragmatic focus on productivity makes it a framework where you can be productive as a solo developer. It's one where you don't need a team in order to be productive. Also, while going through all of these, I just appreciate that the Rails community is really thoughtful and fun-loving. I love you all. You're building a wonderful place in Rails land. Now you'll notice that there's a lot more buildings, right? I had to pick 10 for the tour. I couldn't show you all of them. So if you have a favorite blog post, please do come talk to me afterwards. I'd love to hear about your favorite blog post, how it's impactful maybe for you or for your little corner of the Rails community. And finally, as the sun is setting over Rails land, I would like to point out that there's still construction happening over here. The story of Rails land is not finished. And you can still be a part of it. You can be part of building the next buildings in Rails land. So I would encourage you, get into blogging, share your ideas, write, you'll be part of a tradition not just of Rails land, but a tradition that goes all the way back to the 1600s, to the Republic of Letters. I've been your tour guide, Joël Quenneville. Thank you for attending this tour. I'm a principal developer at Thoughtbot and also a blog author on the Thoughtbot blog. I co-host the Bike Shed podcast at bikeshed.fm. And you can find me online on X at Joël Ken. Here's a list of all of the blog posts that I mentioned. I'll leave this up if you want to take a photo. And thank you for coming.